Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Raymond Craib. He's Marie Underhill Noll Professor of History at Cornell University. His research and teaching interests revolve around the intersections of space, politics, and everyday practice. And today we're going to focus on his book, Adventure Capitalism, A History of Libertarian Exit from the Era of Decolonization to the Digital Age. So, Dr. Craib, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, before we get into the history itself, I would like to ask you first. What would you say characterizes U.S. libertarianism? Because I would imagine there's different types of libertarianism out there, but perhaps there are specific aspects of that ideology in the US that are characteristic of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. As you know, I mean, in Portuguese and in Spanish, libertario is essentially a term that would probably be seen as more synonymous with what we might call anarchist. And so in that instance, we would be talking about people who are against hierarchy and most kind of forms of the state, but also against things like capitalist social relations and capitalism for also being hierarchical and unequal. These are not the kinds of individuals I'm talking about. Libertarianism in the United States, I mean, I use the term libertarian here, with some misgivings, but I didn't want to use terms like anarcho-capitalism, which is another term that one might use. But these are individuals who essentially have a strong opinion about government and the state being as small as possible or being entirely done away with, but are not just, they don't just tolerate capitalism, they actually embrace capitalism and the idea of free enterprise as a kind of basic way to organize and structure society. This is, there's a sort of long tradition of this in certain kinds of ways, some aspects of individualist anarchism from the 19th century, I guess. But really, this is what I'm looking at as a kind of post-World War II phenomenon that has become increasingly prevalent, both amongst the conservative Republican Party in the United States. I mean, you can see this in the halls of Congress starting in the 90s, Rand Paul, Paul Ryan, and others, but also then amongst the kind of Silicon Valley tech elite that I look at too. Yeah.
So one of the things that you cover in the book is how the libertarian thought and practice exploded back in the 1960s. So how and why did that happen, and why specifically in the 1960s?
Yeah, so people who, in some form or another, I think we could put in this sort of orbit of libertarianism, and I use a relatively broad definition. I don't think it's satisfactory to everybody, but it's something that I kind of defaulted to. So I use a kind of broad definition. I look at a range of people under the kind of idea of libertarian. Some you might describe as neoliberal, some you might describe as kind of anarcho-capitalist, but all of them, these were people who were beginning to organize in the 1940s in particular, the 1930s, but especially the 1940s and the 1950s against things like the New Deal that the president of the United States at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, had put into place or was helping to structure in terms of trying to cope with the consequences of the Great Depression. And so a lot of the kinds of questions about the role of the state, the size of the state, the areas of the world, of the economy and social life and political life in which the state intervenes were being sort of questioned, and there was pushback by many of these individuals who organized themselves into different kinds of groups. I mean, certainly things like the Chamber of Commerce, pretty traditional for them. but also the founding of something like the Mont Pelerin Society. And you have a lot of organizing that's going on, both within the United States and outside of it. I think they pick up momentum in the 1960s in interesting ways. You have a candidate running for political office, Barry Goldwater, in the United States in the early 1960s, who's embracing a more far-reaching kind of libertarian language, and there's a kind of mobilization of a kind of myth about the U.S. and U.S. history and the West and the Southwest, and so you see in the 1960s in particular a kind of growth in this, and in interesting ways you see also a kind of resurgence in anti-status politics on the left, of course, in the 1960s as well. I mean, most famously, of course, with 1968, but throughout the 1960s as well, there's a critique coming from the left as well of the state, amongst other things. The last thing I'll say is just one of the interesting thing about the 1960s to me as well is how much, in some ways, it kind of mirrors some of our own moment that we're living through as well. I mean, in the 1960s, there is an enormous amount of writing, both fiction, science fiction, nonfiction, about approaching ecological catastrophe. So you think of Frank Herbert's Dune, which was serialized between 1963 and 1965. Neville Shoots on the Beach and the idea of nuclear fallout and weather patterns. You think of Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, 1968, this kind of Malthusian perspective on population and resource extraction. The Population Bomb by Anne Ehrlich and Paul Ehrlich was also a 1968 book filled with these kinds of apocalyptic scenarios about the demographic explosion on the planet. There's just an enormous amount of writing, and there's an enormous amount of writing also about monetary collapse. And so there's a growing group of a set of groups that are advocating for buying and selling and trading metal, gold and silver in particular, to avoid the possibilities of monetary collapse because of the activities of the Federal Reserve and central banks and things like this, which is a little bit akin to what we're watching with things like Bitcoin. But of course, Bitcoin isn't a currency; it's a speculative investment. But so that's it's a very kind of robust era in the 1960s in particular, and into the 1970s, in which these ideas could kind of begin to resonate. You have people making communes and back to the land and bunker culture, and a lot of that stuff was already around in the 60s.
And what is it that in the book you call exit projects? So and what motivated them exactly?
Yeah, so I use the term exit for a specific kind of project or set of projects. And it's important for me to make some differentiations here. One of the things I was interested in writing about these exit projects was thinking of them as ways in which people now, and also people in the past, for various reasons, some of them more or less understandable, perhaps, or intelligible to me, wanted to essentially escape the structure or constraints of the nation state within which they lived, without necessarily having to become an immigrant or a refugee or something like this. And so the problem for them, of course, is how do you do this if you live on a planet where the planet has essentially been divided up into sovereign nation states, and there's not really many places for you to go. But the basic premise of exit for the people I look at was to leave the nation state as it existed, or the one that they lived in, build a new country of some kind, and then they were very interested in running that country as a kind of, for lack of a better word, a kind of corporation or private society. And so you would live there kind of by signing a contract. Most things would be run through sort of market relations, private market relations. and the like. And that's why I call it libertarian exit, is because of the market side of this, or the contractual, transactional side of it. There are other kinds of ways of thinking about exit, and I use a different term for that in the book. I use the term exile in many cases, and that's, things like the Zapatistas in southern Mexico. You can think of other kinds of communities that are experimenting with different kinds of sovereignty, but they are not trying to build a new country, and they are not building a community that is primarily driven along the lines of contract and so forth. And in many instances, these are communities of people who are pretty radically subordinated in the social structure in the countries in which they live. The Zapatistas are mostly indigenous people who have been persecuted or underserved by their own government. And you can think of maroon communities of escaped former enslaved peoples. We're not talking here about fairly wealthy capitalists, right, when I talk about exile. So that's the kind of, that's what I had in mind when I was thinking about exit. I mean, the one thing I'll say very quickly as a final point on this is by the time I got to the end of the book, it struck me in some ways that that these are projects that are not, in the end, ultimately about exit. They stay closely linked up to the international economy and the like, right? So that and even in their kind of form, they can often resemble certain kinds of things that we would associate with the nation state. And so they're kind of a different kind of sovereignty, I guess, in some ways, but they're not a kind of someone extracting themselves entirely out of the system and just completely opting out, which may be the case, that it's just not possible to do that anyway.
So about these exit projects that you explore in the book, and some of them, some of the countries that people tried to create these projects were developed by people like, for example, Michael Oliver. And one very interesting thing that I found by reading about them in your book was that, interestingly enough, many of them, if not all of them, were they tried to develop them in places that were former colonies, so that were undergoing decolonization. So why is that? Why is it that Michael Oliver and perhaps other people were trying to develop new countries in those particular places?
Yeah, the 60s, 50s, and 60s were the high era of decolonization, at least in the 20th century. I mean, if you look at the 19th century, of course, Latin America decolonized. So partially there's this enormous activity happening around the globe, and so one could imagine that just at one level, it would make sense that sooner or later these are projects that would run into places that are decolonizing. But I think it's much more than that. I mean, there was a conscious decision. I mean, Oliver wrote about this in a small book that he published in 1968, A New Constitution for a New Country, and also in a newsletter that he produced that was had various titles at various points in time. At one point, it was called the M. Oliver Newsletter, and another point, it was called the Capitalist Country Newsletter. But essentially, what he wrote was that they, those interested in creating a new country should look at places that are decolonizing, precisely as he put it, because these are places that are far away from the mother country. The mother country may not be particularly interested in them right now. There's a lot of change happening, and that they could, in fact, they being the exiters, could go and essentially set themselves up. And by the time that the mother country or colonial officials found out about it or something, it might be too late, right? But the idea here basically is that these were places of kind of opportunity, because political change, pretty dramatic political change, was taking place. And it makes perfect sense when you are looking at a moment in which political structures are undergoing pretty substantial change. And he did encounter at certain points in time allies among people in places that were decolonizing, because they were looking for alternatives to just the standard kind of nation state model coming out of colonial rule. And so I think he actively was looking at various kinds of possibilities. He looked at the high seas of the open ocean, and then he looked at places that were, in fact, decolonizing. So the Bahamas and the Caribbean is one place I look at, and then I look at the archipelago of the New Hebrides in the Southwest Pacific, which became in 1980 Vanuatu. And so these are the kinds of, and there was a lot of experiment like this at the time. I mean, in the 1960s, you had a variety of individuals thinking about and trying to, in some form or another, establish a new country on the water, either in the Caribbean or sometimes on the high seas. And of course, you have some famous examples that had some longevity, such as Sealand in the North Sea, right? The Republic of Sealand, so or the Kingdom of Sealand, right? So that was his. That for many of these individuals, this was what they saw as possibilities. They were looking at a lot of places, not just places that were decolonizing, mind you, but places that had traditionally, where a lot of this experimentation had been done in the 19th century as well, places like Honduras and elsewhere. But a lot of interest in looking around the Circum Caribbean, the island Caribbean, and the Southwest Pacific in particular.
But the fact that these places were decolonizing is very interesting, because I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it seems that they were looking, at least many times, for places where people were undergoing decolonization, but at the same time, the way they dealt with the local peoples, I mean, doesn't it seem that they were trying to, in some other way, recolonizing them? And if that's the case, it's very interesting, because we hear many times from American libertarians, at least the most extreme types, that the state is all bad and is all oppressive, and if we were all libertarians, it would just all be freedom and stuff like that, and a libertarian society would be more moral or more ethical. But it doesn't really seem to be the case in the particular examples that you explore in the book. I mean, do you agree with that or not?
Yeah, generally I do agree with that. They both in the 1960s and now, people involved in these kinds of projects use the language of colonization. The seasteaders, for example, who I write about in the book, talk about colonizing the high seas. There's, of course, discussion of colonizing Mars and colonizing the moon and so forth. And so the language of colonization is there. And so, yes, I do think that generally these are, to my mind, kind of reconstituting certain kinds of forms of power that one could associate with colonial rule. There's these moments of kind of ambiguity at times, and I think the case of Vanuatu is probably the best case of this, in which you have some internal conflicts amongst native Vanuatu themselves, around what independence should look like, what kind of political structure they should have in place, who should be in control, and so forth. And that's not surprising. But then, a group of libertarians, including Michael Oliver, but also others as well, John Hospers, F. Thomas Eck III, who was an attorney at the time, come in and essentially back one side in this. It's not really a conflict, but it turns into a conflict, but doesn't really start as a conflict. But they back one side of this kind of discussion or political organizing, in the hopes that they'll be able to establish themselves in terms of a kind of new country and special economic zone and things like this. But generally, yes, I mean, I would agree with you. These are projects that at some level seem to kind of replicate in new fashion sort of older forms of colonialism, but they do it under the guise of choice. Right? They use the language of choice and freedom as a way to kind of sell, right, or promote the projects, right? As you mentioned, there's a kind of rhetoric to all of this that sounds very sunshiny, right? But may not be so. Yeah.
So, and referring now a little bit more to the contemporary Silicon Valley techno-libertarian types, let's say, like, I don't know, people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and others like that. I mean, in what ways are there some of their ideas and perhaps projects similar to the ones brought forth by people like Michael Oliver, and in what ways do you think they might differ a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of family resemblances here. They're quite similar to each other. I mean, I think the similarities are certainly a kind of disdain for the state. And even though, of course, Musk and Thiel and Bezos, these are all individuals who've the foundation for their wealth has come in part from public funding of excellent institutions and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So there's that component to it. There's a strong kind of the general sort of libertarian sensibility, I think, is there, a kind of shared one. And certainly the idea of somehow or another getting out of the nation state form and finding something new, something different, or creating something new and something different is there as well. One of the individuals associated with some of these projects, Patrick Friedman, who's the grandson of Milton Friedman, the University of Chicago economist, and the son of David Friedman, who's kind of anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, writing in the 1970s and the 1980s. He writes about being inspired by Burning Man and this idea that you can sort of let 1,000 nations bloom and so forth. And this is kind of part of the language of seasteading, amongst other things. And so there's a lot of that kind of similarity with the projects of the 1960s and the 1970s, not just Michael Oliver, but there's a whole array of people involved in these projects. Harry Schultz, who was a kind of finance guru, and a whole array of other individuals, so not just Oliver. There's a little bit of a difference too. I mean, the tech side of things is an obvious difference. There's a whole array of ways in which people talk about exit now, including getting off the planet, right, and going to places like Mars and the Moon, or orbital colonization. And then there's also exit in terms of transferring your consciousness into digital code, cryogenics, a lot of these kind of more fantastical scenarios that are being experimented with because people have the sort of disposable income to do so. So the tech side of it is one thing, but the other thing I would say is the other difference I would probably emphasize, and that I try to articulate in the book as well, is that for someone like Michael Oliver, there were other individuals similar to Michael Oliver, a man by the name of Werner Stiefel, who was based in upstate New York. These were individuals who had pretty traumatic experiences in their life in terms of persecution by the Nazis in Germany, or by Stalin, and had a kind of intense and visceral and understandable fear of totalitarianism writ large, regardless of how they sort of understood it. And so the aspirations to escape or to exit were, in many respects, ideological in terms of their libertarian politics, but they were also very immediate in terms of their own kind of personal experience and the kind of things that they brought with them. And so Oliver would write about it as a moral experiment, at some level. He thought this was a moral experiment that would, in some form or another, create the conditions for people such as himself to be protected in many ways. The contemporary, the folks we're talking about now, the tech libertarian, I think there's a little bit of a different thing going on here, and I think it's less about things like the trauma and the experience, and I think it's a lot more about this idea that that one can bend reality to one's will. And so there's an enormous amount of hubris and ego, I think, involved in these projects. It's not uncommon to hear some of the tech libertarians talk about the ways in which setting up new nations on, new kind of floating private states on the ocean or something like this will create an example that will then refract back onto or rebound back onto the existing traditional nation state system and kind of force nation states to rewrite their regulatory apparatus, reducing it, of course, rewrite their taxation systems, reducing taxation, of course, because they would set up a system where these new states would compete with other nation states, existing nation states, for citizen consumers, right? So it's a model about creating a kind of consumer opt-in, opt-out kind of paradigm. It's very idealized, and it all sounds very straightforward theoretically, but of course it's completely a jumble when you actually look at the possibilities of how things like this might be instituted. So, I think the contemporary projects differ in that respect. I do think there's a kind of an enormous hubris involved in the contemporary projects that and the tech component to it that make it a little bit different than some of the projects from the 60s and the 70s. So both some similarities and some differences.
So at a certain point there, you mentioned how these people usually tend to think about the state and the role that the state plays in a capitalist system, let's say. But do they get that right? I mean, is it really possible to, or would it be possible to divorce, let's say, a capitalist system from a state? I mean, isn't it the case that for capitalism to operate normally, it needs a state and a big bureaucratic system to, for example, maintain property rights, oversee contracts, stabilize currencies, and all of that? Isn't that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think underneath the sort of hyperinflated rhetoric that they offer, right, it is, as you start to look at it, you don't have to look at it that closely, I guess. I mean, it's right there. As you said, I mean, part of the project, I think, for many of these individuals is precisely this: how do you maintain something that's akin to the state structure, right? To ensure, but the idea is, rather than have the state be sovereign and the market sit underneath the state, that you flip it, right? The market is sovereign and the state exists largely, right, as a kind of way to support it only in certain ways. So the common refrain for most of the libertarians, both in the 60s and 70s and now, is the minimalist state or ultra minimalist state or night watchman state. There's variations in the terminology that they use, but they all share a similar kind of, I think, relatively straightforward perspective about the state here. And that is that you have to have some kind of state for precisely the reason that you've just laid out, right? And so when they talk about a minimalist state, what they're talking about is that you need some kind of structure in place for national defense, some kind of structure in place to defend private property rights, policing, basically, that you need an office to defend you from fraud. You need an office in patent law. You need a judiciary to deal with questions of, or an arbitration board of some kind to deal with questions of conflict around contract and so on and so forth. And so they'll call this a minimalist state, but it's important to stress that it's not minimalist in its size. It's just minimalist in the scope of its activities, in things like national defense and policing and contract enforcement and patent law and so on and so forth. It means you're going to have actually a relatively big state in terms of its actual size and perhaps the amount of money and the size of its bureaucracy and so forth. It just means, though, when minimalist just means that its functions are going to be very, very constrained in terms of what it is tasked with doing, that everything else will be left to the operations of kind of contract. So, yeah, that's I think you're absolutely right here that this kind of fantasy about an utterly or totally privatized state is very problematic. The one person who kind of embraced this idea for a while, Murray Rothbard, sort of, one of the sort of godfathers of U.S. libertarianism, kind of abandoned this in the late 70s and took a kind of conservative turn in the 1980s and became a follower of Pat Buchanan and this kind of, paleo old white man conservatism of the 1980s. And so, even he sort of abandoned some of the kind of harder lines that he was taking around these things. I mean, he thought the military should be run through private contract and everything. And it's, in some ways, I guess, with the amount of private contractors there are these days in the war machine, some of that came true, I guess. But so anyway, I'm digressing. But yeah, so clearly the state, right, there's some kind of state apparatus, even in the most kind of utopian libertarian visions here.
Mm-hmm. So in the interest of time, I would like to ask you just one last question then. So these projects we talked about that people came up with during the second half of the 20th century, do they intersect in any way with the history of 20th century capitalism and with things like the development of, I think some people call the neoliberal ideology and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, these are part of a spectrum. They're part of a kind of, there's a lot of continuity here. I mean, I think the libertarian politics of the late 90s and coming into the 21st century are in some ways a kind of logical extension of the sort of neoliberal turn of the 70s and the 80s, and particularly the 80s. And so, I don't think you can sort of extract Reagan or Thatcher from the equation here. I don't think you can extract, the operations of the International Monetary Fund or the WTO in the 1980s, things like austerity measures, reduction in government services, forcing governments to open up their economies, the debt crisis of the 1980s. I mean, there's an enormous amount of activity in the 1980s that essentially looked at undermining the kind of regulatory welfare aspects of the state. It's not that those things weren't being undermined earlier, changes weren't happening. I'm not trying to suggest that, but certainly you see it become much more prominent in the 1980s and then into the 1990s. And so there's a constant effort to increasingly push against, what kind of places and what areas of life the state exists in. So I think it's very much connected to, I mean, this is why I see in some sense libertarian as a big tent definition in the book, is because I want to ensure that people and processes that we associate with neoliberalism fit into the kind or sit next to when people think about these vis-a-vis libertarianism. And the most obvious example here is to think about something like, and this goes back to your question about the state, something like the Pinochet government, right, the dictatorship in Chile after 1973, and the radical privatization of Chile's economy that was done in conjunction with the Chicago boys of Milton Friedman, and essentially, privatized a huge amount of Chile's economy, put an enormous amount of enterprises, public enterprises, into private hands. And now, there's a rewriting of the Constitution, because the military dictatorship put a constitution into place in 1980, a forcible. This was a dictatorship, a forcible, constitution that said free enterprise was the only sort of economic model. And this is finally being, there's efforts now to finally rewrite that constitution, and to deal with the disaster in some ways that economic model has been for many Chileans. Massive transfer of wealth into a small number of hands, including Pinochet's hands and his own family's hands. So, yeah, I see the neoliberal, what we talk about as neoliberalism, as part and parcel of this kind of broader dialogue that we could, put under libertarian umbrella.
Mm-hmm. And neoliberalism in this case, I am asking you about that because some people come up with critiques like saying that neoliberalism is a sort of a nebulous term or meaningless, but it means things like pushing for privatization, weakening labor rights, weakening workers' unions, weakening the welfare state and stuff like that, correct?
Yes. I think that's a fairly fair description. It is a kind of position that, again, sits relatively comfortably within the broader ideas of libertarianism that we've been talking about, precisely for the reasons that you just said. And of course, if you look at some of these plans or models for things like free private cities or charter cities and so forth, many of them have a kind of idealized, nostalgic vision of Hong Kong in mind when they put them together, but they also, things like you're not going to have voting rights, right? You're going to sign a contract, and either you like the place or you don't like the place. If you like it, you opt in. If you don't like it, you opt out. But it's a very idealized vision of how the sort of movement of people and how international law and finance and so on and so forth works. But it's exactly this undermining of things like collective bargaining rights and unionizing and amongst a whole array of other kinds of questions about regulation and social supports and the like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is again Adventure Capitalism, a history of libertarian exit from the era of decolonization to the digital age. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. Dr. Craib, just before we go, would you like to tell people, apart from the book, where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. I do have a website at cornell.edu. If you go to cornell.edu, you can click on the link to academics and then to the history department, and you can find out a little bit more about me there. And there's some links to some of my other writing, both on this project and some of the earlier work that I've done, and also contact info if you want to be in touch with me. So.
Great. So thank you so much again for your time, and it was a big pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise, a pleasure for me, Ricardo, and thank you. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. You will find links to it in the description box of this interview. And also, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Perorga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Castle, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paulo Jorge Arnaud, Luke Kloaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DR PMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zoll, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, and Chris Story. A special thanks to my producers Isa Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Van Egdem, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, Thomas Trumple, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.